The Delta Quadrant had a particular quality of silence that Catherine Janeway had never quite gotten used to, even after years of navigating its alien immensity. It wasn't the silence of deep space as she'd known it in the Alpha Quadrant. That familiar quiet threaded through with the distant hum of Federation beacons, relay stations, the soft gravitational whisper of charted territory. Out here, 60,000 light-years from home, the silence had weight. It pressed against Voyager's hull like something sentient, like something that had been waiting long before humanity learned to look up at the stars and wonder. She was on the bridge, second coffee cooling in her hand, reviewing stellar cartography data on the Delta Quadrant's Necrit expanse boundary, when Ensign Kim broke the silence in the way he always did, with the particular sharp intake of breath that meant something had gone wrong in a new and creative way. "Captain," his voice carried that specific frequency of controlled alarm she'd learned to recognize. "I'm reading an energy signature approximately 400,000 kilometers off the port bow. It's—" He paused. The pause was long enough to worry her. "I don't have a classification for it." Janeway set down her coffee. "On screen." What appeared on the view screen stopped every conversation on the bridge mid-syllable. It was a vessel, or it had the rough geometry of one. But where Federation ships were defined by clean lines and deliberate symmetry, in where Klingon warships carried their aggression in angular purpose, where even Borg cubes had the brutal honesty of pure function, this thing defied every category she possessed. It was organic and vast, its surface rippling with bioluminescent patterns that shifted like thought made visible. It moved without visible propulsion, trailing light the way a deep-sea creature trails phosphorescence, not burning through space so much as existing within it differently than everything else around it. Its profile suggested no weapons, no shields in any configuration her sensors could interpret. It suggested instead something far more unsettling. It suggested age. "Tuvok," Janeway said quietly. "Scanning." The Vulcan's voice was measured, but she caught the almost imperceptible pause before he continued. "The vessel's hull material does not correspond to any known substrate in our database. It appears partially biological, partially crystalline, with an energy output that my instruments are having difficulty quantifying." Another pause. For Tuvok, this was the equivalent of open-mouthed astonishment. "Captain, the vessel's apparent age, based on isotopic decay readings, is approximately 1 million years. The bridge held its collective breath. "Hailing frequencies," Janeway said. "Open." "This is Captain Catherine Janeway of the Federation Starship Voyager. We are a vessel of exploration. We mean no harm." She kept her voice level, authoritative, precisely calibrated to the particular frequency of first contact, not submission, not aggression, the narrow diplomatic corridor between. "Please respond." The silence that answered her was different from the Delta Quadrant's usual silence. This one felt considered, deliberate, as though something on the other end of those hailing frequencies was deciding not whether to respond, but how, and whether the answer would be in any language she could process. Then B'Elanna Torres said, from engineering, "Captain, I'm reading a new energy buildup, not from the vessel, from behind it. Spatial geometry is... I'm reading a localized fold in subspace. Something is opening." On the view screen behind the ancient drifting vessel, Space Tour, there was no other word for it. It wasn't the clean blue-white aperture of a Federation transwarp conduit, nor the violent crimson of a Borg transwarp tunnel. It was a hole, a wound in the fabric of space itself, as circular and edged with a cold amber light, and through it came ships. They were white, sleek and predatory, smaller than Voyager but bristling with an engineered confidence that spoke of civilizations that had learned to fight things far worse than anything this quadrant had ever produced. 3 of them, then 5, then 8, arrowing out of the aperture in formation with the practiced cohesion of a fleet that had seen real war and survived it. The aperture sealed behind them with a sound which was impossible in vacuum. Yet somehow Voyager's external sensors registered it, like the closing of a very old door. "Red alert," Janeway said, because there was nothing else to say. "Shields up." But do not arm weapons. Not yet. Chakotay leaned toward her from the first officer's chair. 8 vessels. And their energy signatures are completely unlike the first ship. These are technological, not biological. Different origin. 2 civilizations, Janeway murmured, watching the white fleet arrange itself in a protective arc around the ancient glowing vessel. In the same place, at the same time, in the middle of the Delta Quadrant. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Someone planned this. The comm channel crackled. Not Voyager's hailing frequency, but a direct tight beam transmission, cutting through her shields with casual precision and arriving on her bridge with the confident ease of people who had long since stopped being impressed by communication technology. Federation vessel. The voice was human, male, carrying the particular, worn-down authority of someone who had given too many impossible orders over too many years and had learned to live with the consequences. This is President John Sheridan of the Interstellar Alliance. I realize this situation looks alarming from your end. Believe me, it looks fairly alarming from ours as well. I'd like to suggest we talk before anyone does anything we'll all regret. A beat. I've learned in my experience that the Vorlons rarely do anything without a reason. I just haven't figured out what their reason is this time. I was hoping you might have some insight. Janeway looked at Tuvok. Tuvok looked at Janeway. 7 of 9 at her station near the aft console studied the data streaming across her screen with an expression that, on anyone else, might have been called fascinated unease. Janeway opened the channel. President Sheridan, she said, I'm Captain Janeway, and I have to be honest with you. I don't know what a Vorlon is. The pause on the other end was brief but weighted. Captain, Sheridan said, that might be the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me, and I once watched a shadow vessel eat a star. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The conference room off Voyager's bridge was not designed for the weight of what was about to be said inside it. Janeway had convened the meeting with the particular brisk efficiency she used when she needed to impose order on situations that were resisting it. So Tuvok sat to her left, hands folded, his expression calibrated to Vulcan neutrality, but his eyes tracking everything. Chakotay was to her right, quiet and observational in the way he always was when he was doing serious thinking. 7 of 9 had positioned herself slightly apart from the others, as she often did, standing rather than sitting, her posture carrying the residual geometry of Borg spatial awareness, always calculating angles, distances, threat vectors. The doctor had joined them via a holographic relay from sickbay, his expression caught between professional curiosity and the particular affronted bewilderment of a being whose medical database had just been rendered partially obsolete. On the other side of the table, Sir President John Sheridan sat with the easy stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments in any negotiation were the ones that looked calm. He was perhaps 50, carrying his age the way soldiers carried old injuries. Present, but not debilitating, integrated into who he'd become rather than subtracted from it. Beside him sat Delenn, and Janeway had needed a carefully controlled moment when the Minbari ambassador had entered the room, because Delenn was visibly structurally something other than human. The bone crest rising from her skull, the particular stillness of her dark eyes, the way she held herself with the dignity of someone who had been, at various points in her life, both more and less than what she currently appeared. Behind Sheridan stood a Narn, massive, scale-patterned, and watching everything with fierce amber eyes, who had introduced himself simply as Gakar, and who had thus far said nothing but whose silence felt more eloquent than most people's speeches. Let me start with the obvious question, Janeway said, and then we'll work outward from there. Where are you from? Sheridan leaned forward slightly. That's going to take some context. I have time. What followed was 40 minutes that Janeway suspected would reconfigure her understanding of the universe more thoroughly than anything since Voyager had first been dragged to the Delta Quadrant. Sheridan spoke with the practiced economy of someone who had explained extraordinary things to skeptical audiences before. He gave her the shape of it first, then the details. reading her reactions with the attentiveness of a man who knew when he was losing his audience and when he was landing his points. The Babylon 5 station, the younger races, the ancient ones, Vorlon and Shadows, beings a million years old who had spent those million years conducting a philosophical argument about the correct way to guide the development of younger civilizations, using those civilizations as the argument's evidence. The Shadow War. The choice that had ended it, not a military victory but a moral confrontation. Sheridan and Delenn standing before the assembled ancient powers and telling them, with the particular audacity of youth, that it was time for them to leave. "You told your gods to go home," Chakotay said at one point. His voice carried something that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite admiration, but lived in the territory between. "We told them they'd done enough," Sheridan said. "Whether they were gods is a question I've never been entirely comfortable answering." He glanced briefly at Delenn. Something passed between them that Janeway recognized. The shorthand of people who had survived the same impossible thing together and still weren't sure what to make of it. The Vorlons left, most of them. They went beyond the rim, beyond known space. The idea that one of them is here, in a completely different universe. He paused, and for the first time she saw something underneath the command authority, a controlled, well-managed version of fear. That's not supposed to be possible. And Vorlons don't do things that aren't supposed to be possible without a reason. "What kind of reasons have they had before?" Tuvok asked. It was Gakar who answered. His voice was deep and deliberate, each word placed with the care of someone who had learned that careless words cost lives. "The Vorlons shaped us," he said. "All of us. Narn, Centauri, Minbari, human. They visited our worlds millions of years ago and encoded within our genetic structure a specific perceptual framework. When we look at a Vorlon, we see an angel. We see whatever our culture understands as divine. They engineered our capacity for worship and then positioned themselves as its object." He paused. "This was not done for our benefit." The silence in the conference room had a different quality now. 7 of 9 spoke for the first time. They modified the cognitive architecture of multiple species to ensure a predetermined response to their presence. Her voice was measured, analytical, but Janeway caught the particular undertone that she'd learned to read in 7. The one that meant something had struck closer than 7 intended to show. That is, a comprehensive violation of individual autonomy. "Yes," Delenn said quietly, "it is. And it is also why we were able to stand against them in the end. Because we understood what they had done and chose differently anyway." "The fact remains," Sheridan said, "that one of them is outside your ship right now. And it brought us here, which means it wants something." He looked at Janeway directly. "In my experience, Captain, what Vorlons want is almost never simple, rarely comfortable, and occasionally catastrophic. I'd like to know as much about your situation as you now know about mine before that ship decides to tell us what it has in mind." Janeway held his gaze for a moment. She'd met a handful of people in her career who carried authority the way Sheridan did. Not performed, not enforced, but simply present, like a fact about them. She'd been told she was one of them. It was strange to recognize the quality from the outside. "Fair enough," she said. She began to talk. She told him about the caretaker, about 70,000 light-years of hostile territory standing between her crew and home, about the Borg, and she watched his face carefully as she described them, watched the way his eyes moved to Gakar's and held there for half a second. "A species that assimilates others," Sheridan said slowly, "absorbs their technology, their identity, their autonomy, turns them into extensions of a collective will." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The Shadows would have found them very interesting." "Would have." "The Shadows are gone." He said it with the flatness of absolute conviction, and then, almost immediately, a shadow of his own crossed his face. The instinct of a man who had learned never to be entirely certain of anything. "They should be gone." It was Tuvok who broke the pause that followed. "Captain, I am receiving new sensor data from the bridge." He touched his comm badge. "Ensign Kim, report." Kim's voice came through with the careful control of someone delivering news he hadn't finished processing himself. "The Vorlon vessel is Doing something, it's projecting some kind of energy field. It's not weapons-based, not shields, it's a pause. Commander Tuvok. Yeah, it's targeted. Narrow beam. It's aimed directly at one of our crew members. Janeway was already on her feet. Which crew member? A beat that lasted too long. 7 of 9, Captain. 7 of 9 was already moving when Janeway reached the corridor. Not fleeing. 7 of 9 did not flee. She was walking with the precise, controlled urgency of someone who had detected an anomaly and was proceeding toward it with full analytical intent. Her Borg-enhanced senses clearly registering something that the rest of Voyager's crew was only beginning to measure on instruments. Janeway fell into step beside her, and the look Seven turned on her was one she'd learned to parse over years of careful relationship building. The expression of a being who had been many things and was still deciding what she was, and who had just encountered a variable that was making that decision considerably more complicated. "What are you feeling?" Janeway asked. "I do not—" Seven stopped. The hesitation was brief but significant. 7 of 9 did not hesitate in her speech. "I am experiencing a sensory input I cannot classify. It is not electromagnetic. It is not gravitational. It does not correspond to any frequency within the Borg Collective's accumulated knowledge base, which encompasses the assimilated experience of approximately 10,000 species." She paused again. "It feels like being seen." They reached the corridor viewport, and Janeway looked out at the Vorlon vessel, still drifting 400,000 kilometers off the port bow, still trailing its cold bioluminescent light through the Delta Quadrant's darkness. From here it looked almost serene, almost patient. The narrow beam energy field that Tuvok's instruments had detected was invisible to the naked eye, but Janeway found herself imagining it, a single thread of something ancient and deliberate, stretching across the void between that vessel and the woman standing beside her. Sheridan reached them 30 seconds later, slightly out of breath, with Delenn a half step behind him, and G'Kar moving with the silent efficiency of a man who had survived enough ambushes to always know where the exits were. "The targeting beam," Sheridan said, looking at Seven. "Is it causing any distress?" "No," Seven said. Then, with the precision that was her most characteristic quality, "Not physical distress." Sheridan studied her with the particular attentiveness of a man who had spent years learning to read the faces of non-human beings. "Has anything like this ever happened to you before?" "I was assimilated by the Borg at the age of 6, Seven said. "I spent 18 years as a component of a collective consciousness before being severed from it. I have been examined by a considerable variety of entities. What I am experiencing now is different from all of those." She turned to look at him directly. "You said the Vorlon encoded a perceptual architecture within your species, a capacity for a specific response." "Yes, I was human before assimilation. The encoding would be present in whatever biological substrate the Borg preserved." She said it with the clinical detachment she used as armor, but underneath it, Janeway heard the thing Seven never quite said directly. The ongoing discomfort of being a palimpsest, human and Borg written over each other, neither fully legible. But the Borg also restructured my neural pathways fundamentally. I am simultaneously a being who should respond to Vorlon presence in the encoded way, and a being whose cognitive architecture was rebuilt from the ground up by a collective that recognizes no authority but its own. She looked back at the vessel. "I suspect that is why it is interested in me." "Two sets of programming," G'Kar said from behind them, his voice carrying that quality Janeway had already identified as philosophical weight held lightly. "Each designed to subsume the individual, and yet here you stand." Seven turned to look at him. Something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or the beginning of it. G'Kar had his own history with subjugation, with the long work of reassembling identity from the wreckage of occupation. Janeway had known him for approximately 90 minutes, but she could read that much in him. "The question," G'Kar continued, "is whether the Vorlon is interested in you because you represent an anomaly it cannot categorize, or because you represent something it has been looking for." He paused. "With Vorlon, those two things are frequently the same." Janeway turned to Sheridan. "Can you communicate with it, directly?" "Sometimes." He said it with the grimness of experience. "Vorlon communication is not what you'd call straightforward. They speak in metaphor in image, in question. They rarely tell you anything directly. They prefer to arrange circumstances so that you arrive at the answer yourself. He glanced at the viewport, which is exactly what seems to be happening right now. I'd like to try hailing them again, Janeway said. You can try, but I'd suggest... He stopped. His expression shifted. The particular shift of someone whose instincts, honed by years of surviving things that should have killed him, were suddenly firing. Where's your bridge? We should be on your bridge. Janeway was already moving. Why? Because in my experience, when a Vorlon focuses on a specific individual, it's usually the opening move of something considerably larger. He was keeping pace with her easily, his voice carrying the calm of someone describing weather patterns that happen to include hurricanes. And larger, where Vorlons are concerned, tends to arrive quickly and from unexpected directions. They were halfway to the bridge when the ship shuddered. Not a weapon's impact. Janeway knew the particular bone-deep percussion of that, had felt it too many times. This was different. A harmonic resonance, felt more than heard, as though Voyager's hull were a bell that something very large had struck very gently. The lights flickered. Not from power failure. The diagnostic board showed all systems normal, but with the specific quality of interference, as though something was briefly present on a frequency that light itself was responding to. Then every screen on Voyager, every console, every display, not every holographic interface went dark simultaneously. And in the darkness, on every screen, the same image appeared. It was not a face. It was not a symbol. It was not language in any configuration the universal translator could process. It was light arranged with intention, the specific, dense intentionality of a communication from something that had been thinking for 1,000,000 years and had chosen this precise moment to share a fraction of that thought. It lasted 4 seconds. When the screens returned to normal, 7 of 9 was standing completely still in the corridor, her hand pressed flat against the bulkhead, her eyes focused on something approximately 800,000 years away. 7. Janeway touched her arm. What did you see? 7 turned to her slowly. The expression on her face was one Janeway had never seen there before. Not confusion, not analysis, not the careful reconstruction of emotion that 7 practiced like a learned language. This was something raw, something that had gotten past the defenses. A question, 7 said. It asked me a question. What question? 7 looked at her, and for a moment the weight of it showed completely, undisguised. It asked me who I am, she said, and I did not have an answer. Behind them, Sheridan let out a long, slow breath. It's already started, he said quietly. Whatever it came here for. It's already started. The Vorlon vessel did not move for 6 hours, which had simply existed in Voyager's sensor range with a particular quality of patience that belonged to things that measured time in geological epochs rather than minutes, present, aware, and entirely unhurried. Janeway used those 6 hours the way she always used unexpected stillness, as aggressively as possible. She had Tuvok run continuous passive scans, feeding every fragment of data into the computer for analysis that she knew would ultimately be inadequate, but which gave her crew something purposeful to do with their hands while their minds worked on the larger problem. She had Torres cross-reference the Vorlon vessel's energy signature against every anomalous reading in Voyager's logs since arriving in the Delta Quadrant. She had the doctor run a complete neurological workup on 7 of 9, who submitted to it with the particular cooperative impatience of someone who considered the exercise unlikely to yield useful results, but understood the human need for procedure. The doctor's findings were, as 7 had predicted, inconclusive. Her neural pathways showed no new modifications, no external tampering, no Borg-style intrusion. Whatever the Vorlon's focused beam had done, it had done it without leaving biological fingerprints. It's as though something knocked on the door, the doctor said, with the affronted precision of a physician whose tools had been made to feel inadequate, and then waited politely on the step. I can confirm the knock. I cannot tell you what's holding the flowers. Sheridan spent the 6 hours in the conference room with Delenn and Gakar. Orn and Janeway joined them when the passive scans had settled into their monitoring rhythm. She brought Chakotay and Tuvok. She left Seven on the bridge with instructions to report any change in the Vorlon vessel's behavior, and the unspoken understanding that Seven's proximity to events, whatever its nature, made her more useful as an antenna than as a conference room participant for the moment. What Janeway wanted from those 6 hours was simple in conception and demanding in execution. She wanted to understand exactly what she was dealing with, not the broad strokes Sheridan had given her in their first meeting, but the operational specifics, the things that would matter if this situation moved from cryptic to dangerous. She got more than she bargained for. G'Kar spoke for nearly an hour, and Janeway found herself listening with the specific quality of attention she reserved for sources that were simultaneously completely credible and almost impossible to integrate. He had written, he told her, extensively on the nature of the Vorlon, had in fact spent a portion of his life constructing a theology around them before the Shadow War had dismantled his certainties and replaced them with harder-won understanding. The Vorlon were not evil, he said, in the way that smaller, younger cruelties were evil. They were something more complicated than that. They believed, with the absolute conviction of the ancient and the powerful, that they understood what younger races needed in order to reach their potential. They had shepherded civilizations for 1,000,000 years. They had occasionally, when a civilization failed to develop along the lines they considered correct, arranged for that civilization's removal. Removed, Chakotay said carefully. You mean? I mean that entire worlds were rendered uninhabitable, G'Kar said, with the flat directness of someone who had long since passed the point where euphemism served any purpose. When the Vorlons decided a species was irredeemably compromised by shadow influence, they deployed planet killers, organic vessels of immense destructive capacity. He paused. They called it gardening. The silence in the conference room had a specific texture after that. And this is the entity currently parked off our port bow, Janeway said. The Vorlons are not monolithic, Delenn said, and her voice carried the careful modulation of someone who had spent years holding complex truths in balance without letting them collapse into each other. Within their civilization, there were those who believed more strongly in guidance and those who believed more strongly in intervention. The one who remains, who chose not to depart beyond the rim, is not necessarily representative of the worst of what they were. She paused. But it is also not necessarily representative of the best. What would make one stay? Tuvok asked. When the others left. Sheridan had been quiet for a while, letting G'Kar and Delenn carry the exposition, watching Janeway's face as she processed it all. Now he leaned forward. That's the question that's been bothering me for 6 hours, he said. In my universe, the Vorlons left because we gave them a reason to. We told them the younger races were ready to find their own way, and most of them accepted that. He paused. But one didn't. One stayed. And now it's here, in a completely different universe, and it's focused on a member of your crew who represents... He stopped, searching for the framing. Tuvok, you said 7 of 9 was assimilated at age 6, that the Borg restructured her neural pathways. Correct. The Vorlons encoded a specific response pattern into the genetic architecture of younger races, a capacity for a particular kind of perception, a particular kind of, call it spiritual receptivity. 7 would have had that encoding as a human child. He looked at his hands for a moment. The Borg then rebuilt her cognition from the ground up. But they couldn't remove what was genetically encoded. It would be like trying to assimilate away someone's eye color. It's in the substrate. He looked up. What I think the Vorlon is looking at, in 7, is a being who carries its ancient work in her DNA and has simultaneously been subjected to the most radical program of enforced collective identity in this quadrant. It's looking at a being who has been shaped by 2 different philosophies of control, the Vorlon's patient genetic encoding and the Borg's aggressive cognitive assimilation, and has somehow, against all probability, maintained a self. She is the question made flesh, G'Kar said quietly. What question? Chakotay asked. The question the Vorlons and the Shadows argued about for 1,000,000 years, Delenn said. The Shadows believed that strength came from conflict, us from the pressure of chaos forcing evolution. The Vorlon believed it came from order, from guidance, from the careful cultivation of potential. Both were using younger races as their evidence. She paused. 7 of 9 was subjected to the most extreme version of both philosophies simultaneously. Vorlon encoding in her genetics, Borg collectivism in her mind. And she is neither. She is something the argument never accounted for. The comm system chirped. Seven's voice came through with its customary precision, but underneath the precision was something Janeway had learned to hear. The specific frequency of Seven encountering something her considerable resources were insufficient to explain. "Captain, the Vorlon vessel is moving." Janeway was already standing. On screen, they reached the bridge in time to see it. The ancient vessel had not accelerated, had not changed its heading. Instead, it had simply opened. A section of its bioluminescent hull had dilated, slowly and deliberately, the way a living thing opens, rather than the way a mechanical thing deploys. From the aperture, light spilled outward. Not the cold phosphorescence of the vessel's exterior, but something warmer, something that moved with the specific quality of directed intention. And from within that light, something emerged. It was approximately humanoid in the way that a thunderstorm was approximately a weather pattern. Technically accurate in category, catastrophically insufficient as description. It wore the shape of a being because it had learned long ago that beings responded better to shapes they recognized. The light that composed it shifted and reorganized constantly, and where it moved through space, it left a trail of altered atmosphere that Voyager's sensors were recording and failing to interpret simultaneously. Every human crew member on the bridge felt, in that moment, the thing that G'Kar had described. The ancient genetic encoding doing precisely what it had been designed to do across a million years, and an impossible distance between universes. The overwhelming, irrational, structurally inevitable impression of standing in the presence of something divine. Tuvok, who was Vulcan, did not experience this. He recorded the sensor data with characteristic precision. 7 of 9, who was both human and not, stood at her station with her hand pressed against her console, her face carrying an expression that was equal parts recognition and resistance. The encoded response firing in whatever biological substrate remained, and something else, something harder and more personal, pushing back against it. "It's coming toward us," Kim said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shields?" Chakotay asked. Janeway held up one hand. "No." She watched it come. "If it wanted to harm us, it wouldn't have waited 6 hours." She paused. "Open a channel, all frequencies." The channel opened. The Vorlon spoke, not in language, not in anything the universal translator could process. It spoke in the way it always had, the way G'Kar had described, in image, in impression, in the specific emotional architecture of meaning delivered directly to the part of the mind that existed before words. In what it communicated arrived in each person's consciousness simultaneously and differently, shaped by whatever framework each mind used to receive it. What Janeway received was a question about the nature of exploration, whether it was the desire to find new things or the desire to understand what found you. What Chakotay received, he would describe later as a question about belonging. What 7 of 9 received, she did not describe at all. What every human crew member received beneath their individual version was the same foundational statement. 4 words in their own language, delivered with the absolute certainty of geological time. You are not ready. The Borg cube arrived without warning, because Borg cubes always arrived without warning. In the universe did not make exceptions for the inconvenient timing of philosophical confrontations with ancient beings. One moment, Voyager's long-range sensors showed clear space on all vectors. The next, at a distance of approximately 200,000 kilometers and closing at high warp. A structure materialized that Janeway knew with the intimacy of recurring nightmares. 3 kilometers of brutal geometric efficiency, every surface dense with the accumulated technological harvest of 10,000 assimilated civilizations, its green navigation lights pulsing with the cold regularity of a machine that had never once in its existence considered the possibility of uncertainty. The Borg did not hail. They never hailed. They transmitted. "We are the Borg." The voice filled Voyager's bridge with its characteristic, layered quality. Thousands of voices compressed into one, individuality ground into powder, and reconstituted as consensus. The vessel designated unknown origin presents technology outside current Borg parameters. Biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Resistance is futile. For a fraction of a second, the bridge was suspended in the specific stillness that preceded catastrophe. The moment when everyone present understood simultaneously what was about to happen and was still processing the distance between understanding and response. Then Sheridan said, from behind Janeway, with a calm that she would later describe as either deeply reassuring or faintly alarming, "They're going to try to assimilate a Vorlon." "Yes," Janeway said. "Hey, has anyone ever tried to assimilate a Vorlon before?" "Not that we know of." That's that's going to be interesting." He said it with the tone of a man watching someone attempt to arm wrestle a tectonic plate. What happened next happened in 8 seconds, and Voyager's sensors recorded all of it, and the crew would spend considerable time afterward trying to find adequate language for the recording. The Borg cube adjusted its heading toward the Vorlon vessel with the implacable efficiency of a predator that had never encountered prey it could not eventually consume. It deployed its cutting beam, the same focused energy weapon it used to slice through Federation starships like geometric surgery, and directed it at the ancient vessel's hull. The beam struck. The Vorlon vessel did not raise shields. It did not evade. It did not respond with weapons. It did what living things do when something irritating touches them. It reacted. The section of hull where the cutting beam contacted simply reorganized, flowed. The beam passed through material that was no longer there and found itself cutting empty space, while the hull had already closed around the beam's entry point and absorbed whatever energy remained. The Borg adapted. They always adapted. They recalibrated their beam frequency in 0.3 seconds. The collective processing power of 10,000 species running simultaneous analyses, and fired again. The Vorlon vessel absorbed this too. And then, with the specific quality of patience that had characterized everything it had done since its arrival, it turned its attention to the Borg cube. It did not fire a weapon. It sent a signal. Well, not an electromagnetic signal, not a subspace transmission, the something else that it had already demonstrated it was capable of. The direct-to-consciousness communication that bypassed every technical intermediary. It sent the signal not to the cube systems, but to the drones within it, to the biological components of the Borg collective, the assimilated beings that the hive mind used as its hardware, the 10,000 individual consciousnesses compressed beneath collective identity like sediment beneath stone. It asked them who they were. The Borg cube stopped moving. Not powered down, every system continued to function, every light continued to pulse, the structural integrity fields held, and the propulsion systems remained online. But the cube's forward momentum simply ceased, or as though the decision-making apparatus that governed it had encountered a process it could not immediately resolve and had defaulted to stillness while it worked on the problem. On Voyager's bridge, the collective's transmission cut off mid-word. 7 of 9 made a sound. It was small and involuntary. The specific sound of someone experiencing something they had not prepared for. Janeway was at her side in 3 steps. 7. The signal. 7's hand was on her console again, that grounding gesture she'd been using since the Vorlon had first focused on her. The signal it sent to the cube, I felt it. The same question it asked me, but directed at... She stopped. Her jaw tightened. At the voices. The voices. The Borg retain residual consciousness from every assimilated being. It is suppressed, inaccessible, kind of buried beneath collective processing, but it persists. She looked at Janeway, and the expression on her face was the most complex thing Janeway had ever seen there. Grief and recognition, and something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been so heavily defended in Seven's interior architecture. When I was part of the collective, I could hear them sometimes, beneath everything. Individuals, still present, still there, unable to surface. The Vorlon signal went directly to them. She paused. All of them, simultaneously. What does that mean for the cube's functionality? Tuvok asked, which was exactly the right question, and also, Janeway thought, exactly the wrong lens through which to view what had just happened. Unknown, Seven said. The collective process is through consensus. And if the individual components are occupied with something the consensus cannot override, she stopped again. The calculation was visible in her expression. The cube is paralyzed, not damaged, paralyzed. Every drone inside it is simultaneously experiencing the Vorlon's question and unable to route the experience through collective processing because the question is specifically, deliberately addressed to the individual rather than the whole. How long will that last? Chakotay asked. I don't know. Seven's voice was very quiet. I don't know what happens when a Borg drone is asked who it is and remembers. Sheridan had moved to stand at the viewport, watching the motionless cube with an expression of focused assessment. In my universe, the Shadows tried something similar, not with a hive mind, but with the principle, forcing a species to confront its own nature as a weapon. He turned. It never ended cleanly. The cube will recover, Seven said. The collective is resilient. Individual responses will be suppressed and reintegrated, but there will be a period of, she searched for the word, confusion, during which its tactical capacity will be significantly degraded. How long? Janeway asked. Minutes, perhaps longer, not hours. Then we need to decide right now what we do with those minutes. Janeway turned to face the room. Her crew, Sheridan's people, the impossible situation laid out before them with the particular clarity that only genuine crisis provided. The Borg came for the Vorlon. The Vorlon just demonstrated that standard Borg tactics don't apply here. When the cube recovers, it will adapt its approach. And a Borg cube that is specifically adapting to Vorlon technology while simultaneously trying to assimilate it is considerably more dangerous than a standard tactical engagement. We can't fight a Borg cube with Voyager alone, Chakotay said. We've survived encounters before, but not in a direct engagement. You won't be alone. Sheridan's voice carried the particular quality it had carried throughout. The weight of a man who had fought things that made Borg cubes look like a localized problem. My white stars aren't built for this kind of engagement either, but Vorlon hybrid weapons technology has some properties that your ship's arsenal doesn't. He looked at Torres, who had arrived on the bridge midway through the chaos and was currently doing what Torres always did in crisis. Standing at her console looking like she was solving the problem before anyone finished explaining it. Your chief engineer, is she good? Torres looked up. She's standing right here. The corner of Sheridan's mouth moved. Can you interface your tactical systems with mine in... He checked something on a small device on his wrist that looked nothing like any technology Janeway had seen before. 7 minutes. Torres looked at her console, looked at Janeway, looked back at Sheridan with the specific expression of someone who found impossible engineering timelines, personally offensive and professionally irresistible. 5, she said. Do it, Janeway said. Sheridan moved toward the comm panel. Wakes and Janeway heard him open a channel to his White Star fleet. Heard the crisp acknowledgement of commanders who had fought beside him through worse than this, and trusted him the way soldiers trust the person who has led them out of impossible situations before. She heard him give orders with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom tactical coordination in a crisis was as natural as breathing. Then the Borg cube's lights flickered. Its systems began cycling back to full operation. The collective was recovering, as Seven had predicted. And somewhere inside that 3-kilometer monument to enforced identity, 10,000 individual voices were being pressed back down beneath the weight of consensus. Their brief moment of surfacing already being cataloged as an anomaly to be corrected. Janeway thought about that, and then she looked at Seven. Can you reach them? She asked quietly. The way the Vorlon did. Seven turned to her, and in her expression Janeway saw the collision of everything she was. The Borg efficiency and the human feeling and the something that was neither. The thing forged in the space between two kinds of erasure. I don't know, Seven said, but I think that is precisely what the Vorlon has been waiting to find out. Torres made it in 4 minutes and 40 seconds, which Janeway filed away as something to mention in her next personnel review, and then immediately forgot because the Borg cube finished its recovery cycle at 4 minutes and 52 seconds. and the window between those two numbers was where everything happened. And the joint tactical display that Torres had assembled, a hybrid interface that married Voyager's LCARS system to the White Star Fleet's Minbari-derived tactical architecture, with the particular creative violence of an engineer who considered incompatible systems a personal challenge, lit up across the main view screen in a configuration that was equal parts familiar and alien. Janeway took it in with the speed of long practice, identifying the relevant data and discarding the rest in the 2 seconds she had before she needed to start giving orders. 8 white stars arranged in a crescent formation off Voyager's port side, their hulls catching the Delta Quadrant's starlight with a brightness that felt almost aggressive against the surrounding dark. Voyager at the center, shields at maximum, torpedo bays loaded, phaser arrays charged, and ahead of them both, the Borg cube completing its recovery cycle with the grinding, mechanical inevitability of a tidal force. Its cutting beams already recalibrating, its assimilation algorithms already rewriting themselves around the Vorlon encounter data. The Vorlon vessel had not moved. It remained between Voyager and the cube, still and luminous, apparently unconcerned. "They're targeting the Vorlon vessel again," Kim reported. "Different beam configuration. They've already adapted the frequency. And he paused. "They're targeting us as well. Secondary priority, but we're on their acquisition list." "Of course we are," Janeway said. "We're here." She opened the channel to Sheridan's command White Star. "President Sheridan, their targeting is split. If we draw their primary focus, your fleet hits their secondary systems while they're reorienting. Standard harassment pattern." "Understood." Sheridan's voice was crisp. "My ships will target propulsion first, then weapons arrays. In my experience, the most effective way to fight something that adapts is to keep changing what you're asking it to adapt to." "Agreed." She looked at Tuvok. "Full spread, quantum torpedoes. Target their propulsion manifolds on my mark. Don't wait for lock confirmation. In a Borg engagement, confirmation windows are too short to be useful." "Understood, Captain." "Torres." She raised her voice toward the engineering console. "The Vorlon hybrid weapons on the White Stars, what are we looking at?" Torres pulled up the data she'd absorbed during her 4 minutes and 40 seconds of interface work. "Molecular disruptors. The warhead payload uses a resonance frequency that disrupts the molecular cohesion of Borg hull material. It's not an energy weapon, it's a structural one. Their adaptive shields are designed to handle energy. This is..." She paused in the specific way she paused when something impressed her against her better judgment. "This is genuinely creative. It won't penetrate indefinitely, but it'll take them longer to adapt to than anything in our arsenal." "How much longer?" 3, maybe 4 volleys before they compensate. Then we use them last." Janeway straightened. "Make them adapt to everything else first. Make them expensive. Then hit them with the one thing they haven't seen." The Borg cube fired. Its cutting beam had been recalibrated to a rotating frequency modulation, a countermeasure against the adaptive hull behavior the Vorlon had demonstrated, cycling through 17 distinct frequencies per second in an attempt to find one the living hull couldn't absorb quickly enough. It was, Janeway thought, exactly the response she'd have expected. Methodical, comprehensive, the collective applying its full analytical capacity to a problem it had designated solvable. The Vorlon vessel absorbed the first 4 cycles. The 5th cycle found a frequency at the edge of the rotation that caused a visible reaction. Not damage, but response. The hull surface in the contact zone rippled, reorganized, shifted through 3 configurations in rapid succession before settling. The Vorlon vessel had adapted, but for the first time the adaptation had been visibly effortful. "The Borg are learning," Tuvok reported. "They are analyzing the hull's response pattern. They will identify the adaptation mechanism within approximately 9 minutes. Then we have 9 minutes to make them think about something else." Janeway leaned forward. "Mark." Voyager's quantum torpedoes launched in a full spread, 6 warheads tracking toward the cube's aft propulsion array with the clean efficiency of weapons that had been designed specifically for Borg engagements after years of painful experience. Simultaneously, Sheridan's White Stars broke their crescent formation and accelerated into 3 separate attack vectors, each pair of ships targeting a different section of the cube's surface. Power relays, tactical arrays, the primary cutting beam emitter housing, with the coordinated precision of a fleet that had fought shadow vessels and emerged alive, which meant a fleet that knew how to fight things that were larger, older, and more powerful than itself. The cube reoriented. As Janeway had known it would, as she had counted on it doing, the Borg tactical priority system was predictable in its efficiency, always addressing the highest threat vector first, and 8 ships firing simultaneously from 3 directions represented a higher threat calculation than one ancient vessel with an adaptive hull and a philosophical disposition. The cutting beam swung away from the Vorlon vessel, the cube's shields redistributed. In the space that redistribution created, the Vorlon vessel moved, not toward the cube, toward Voyager. It crossed the distance between them with a speed that Voyager's sensors recorded and that Janeway's mind declined to immediately process. And for one vertiginous second, she thought it was attacking. Thought the cryptic ancient being had decided that the chaos of battle was the moment to resolve its interest in Seven of Nine in some final and irreversible way. Instead, it took up a position directly alongside Voyager, close enough that its bioluminescent hull filled the port viewports with shifting light and matched their movement exactly, as though it had decided, after 6 hours of patient observation, that it was ready to participate. What participation looked like for a Vorlon vessel was this. It extended a field. Not a weapons field, not a shield extension, something the sensors identified only as a coherent energy projection with no analog in Voyager's database, spreading outward from the ancient hull to encompass Voyager within its boundary. The effect was immediate and measurable. Every Borg targeting system that attempted to lock onto Voyager lost acquisition. Every sensor beam the collective directed at them scattered and returned incoherent data. Voyager had not become invisible. It had become, from the Borg's perspective, somehow difficult to think about clearly. "They can't get a lock," Kim reported, with the specific quality of disbelief that came from watching your tactical problem solve itself. "Any targeting solution they compute degrades within 0.2 seconds. They're recalculating, but they can't adapt to something they can't fully perceive," Seven said from her station. Her voice was different, focused in a way that went beyond her usual analytical precision, carrying the quality of someone operating closer to their actual edge than they normally permitted. "The field interferes with the collective's sensory processing. They are attempting to compensate through distributed analysis, routing their sensor data through multiple nodes simultaneously to triangulate. But the field disrupts the routing." "How long before they work around it?" Chakotay asked. "Longer than 9 minutes, Seven said. The Vorlon has bought us time. Then we use it." Janeway turned to Tuvok. "Coordinate with Sheridan's fleet. Full assault on their weapons arrays while they're reorienting. I want their primary cutting beam offline before that field degrades." The battle that followed lasted 11 minutes and occupied the kind of time that expanded in memory to fill much larger spaces. Voyager and the White Star Fleet worked with the specific effectiveness of 2 very different military traditions that had, through Torres's engineering and Sheridan and Janeway's coordinated command, found a functional common language. The White Stars hit fast and hard from unexpected angles, their Minbari-derived maneuverability making them difficult targets for a cube that was already processing too many simultaneous problems. Voyager held the center, its quantum torpedoes working methodically through the Borg cube's external systems, with the patient destructiveness of a crew that had been fighting for its survival for years and had gotten very good at it. The Borg adapted, as the Borg always did, but they were adapting to 3 things simultaneously, and the cognitive load of simultaneous adaptation, even for a collective of 10,000, created a degradation in response time that Janeway exploited with everything she had. On the 4th White Star volley, Sheridan gave the order she'd been waiting for. The molecular disruptors fired. The effect on the Borg cube's hull was unlike anything Voyager's visual sensors had recorded in any previous engagement, where energy weapons left scorched geometry, where torpedoes blew clean craters. The molecular disruptors caused sections of the cube's surface to lose coherence. Hull material that had been solid and purposeful became briefly uncertain of its own structural relationship, sections separating at the molecular level, not with violence, but with the specific wrongness of something forgetting how to be itself. 3 sections of the cube's outer hull simply fell away. Into the exposed interior, Voyager fired everything it had. The cube listed. Its power readings dropped 40% in 6 seconds. The cutting beam went dark. The green navigation lights flickered in patterns that the sensors were interpreting as distress signals within the collective. The hive mind responding to critical damage the way a nervous system responds to injury, with rapid systemic communication and the particular quality of a distributed consciousness experiencing something very close to pain. Then the cube did something Janeway had seen only twice in her career. It retreated. Not a tactical withdrawal with clear intent to re-engage. A retreat, moving away from the engagement at maximum speed on a heading that took it away from the Vorlon vessel, away from the White Star Fleet, away from Voyager, into the deep Delta Quadrant, dark with the specific quality of something that had encountered a variable it needed significantly more time to process. The bridge was quiet for a moment. "They'll be back," Seven said. "They will assimilate what they experienced and return with adapted countermeasures. The molecular disruption data alone will occupy their collective analysis for days, but they will return." "Days is better than minutes," Chakotay said. "Yes," Seven agreed. She turned to look at the Vorlon vessel, still alongside Voyager, still extending its incomprehensible field, its bioluminescent hull pulsing with the slow rhythm of something that breathed in geological time. "But the Borg retreated not only because of the damage we inflicted. The collective's logs will show that." "What else made them retreat?" Janeway asked. Seven turned to her, and in her expression was the thing that had been building since the Vorlon's beam had first found her. The question the ancient vessel had asked, still unanswered, still resonating in whatever substrate carried both her human encoding and her Borg restructuring. "The field the Vorlon extended over the ship," Seven said. "So, the Borg could not get a targeting lock because the field interfered with their sensory processing. But that is not the complete explanation." She paused. "Their sensor records will show that when they attempted to analyze Voyager under the field's influence, what their instruments returned was not sensor noise, not interference." Another pause, longer. "What their instruments returned, every time they attempted to resolve a scan of this vessel, was a question." Janeway looked at her. "What question?" 7 of 9 looked back at the Vorlon vessel, and the light from its hull moved across her face in shifting patterns that looked, if you were inclined toward metaphor, very much like thought. "The same one it keeps asking," she said quietly. "Who are you?" The Vorlon came aboard that night. There was no request, no negotiation, and no diplomatic protocol observed. At 0217 hours ship's time, when Voyager was running on skeleton crew and the Delta Quadrant's darkness pressed against the hull with its usual patient weight, the sensors registered a localized energy transition in Cargo Bay 2, the particular signature of the Vorlon's field moving through Voyager's hull, as though the hull were a suggestion rather than a boundary. And by the time Janeway reached the cargo bay with Tuvok in her hand on her phaser, it was already there. It had chosen the cargo bay, she realized later, because that was where 7 of 9 spent her regeneration cycle. 7 was standing at her alcove, not regenerating. She had apparently sensed the transition before the sensors had registered it, which said something about the depth of the connection the Vorlon had established. Something Janeway filed away with the specific quality of concern she reserved for things she couldn't yet act on. The Vorlon's presence filled the cargo bay not with size, it occupied roughly the volume of a large humanoid, but with weight, the specific gravity of a consciousness that had been accumulating experience since before humanity had discovered fire. Its light moved through the cargo bay's utilitarian shadows and made them briefly beautiful, which Janeway resented slightly because it was clearly deliberate. Tuvok raised his tricorder. The tricorder made a sound she had never heard it make before, a brief, almost apologetic tone, and went dark. "Lower it," Janeway said, not because she thought it was dangerous to scan the Vorlon, but because the gesture of scanning felt suddenly in the cargo bay's charged atmosphere, like the wrong language. She stepped forward instead. "I'm Captain Catherine Janeway. This is my ship. If you wanted to speak with us, there are established channels." The Vorlon regarded her. She felt the regard, not as pressure, not as threat, but as the specific quality of attention that belonged to something that had watched civilizations rise and fall, and was now watching her with the same unhurried interest it had applied to everything else. It spoke, or it did the thing that passed for speaking. The direct-to-consciousness delivery of meaning that bypassed language entirely. What arrived in Janeway's mind was not words, but the impression of words, shaped by her own cognitive architecture into something she could process. You lead well, you lead from the front. While you do not ask your crew to walk into darkness, you will not enter yourself. It was not flattery, it was assessment, delivered with the same emotional register as a geological survey. But you lead toward home, always toward home. Every decision filtered through the question of return. Janeway kept her voice level. Is that a criticism? The impression shifted, something that carried the quality of consideration, of a point being examined from multiple angles simultaneously. It is an observation. Purpose shaped by destination is not the same as purpose shaped by the journey. You have not yet decided which kind of leader you are. Sheridan arrived at the cargo bay door at that moment, slightly out of breath, with Delenn beside him and G'Kar a half-step behind. Janeway had sent for him when the sensors first registered the Vorlon's transition. She wanted him present for exactly this, the moment when the ancient being stopped circling and landed. Sheridan took in the scene with the practiced calm of someone for whom Vorlon cargo bay appearances were jarring but not, at the deepest level, surprising. The Vorlon acknowledged him. The quality of that acknowledgement was different from the one it had given Janeway. Less assessment, more recognition. The specific recognition of a relationship that had history. Sheridan. Even in the direct-to-consciousness delivery, the name carried weight. The accumulated weight of everything that name represented in the Vorlon's experience. The Shadow War. The choice made on Zahadam. When the moment when Sheridan had stood before the assembled First Ones and told them the younger races were done being pieces in their game. It's been a while, Sheridan said, and his voice was steady in the way it was steady when it was costing him something. You ended the argument. You sent them beyond the rim. You told them the younger races were ready. Yes, and yet here you are, in a universe where the argument was never had, where the younger races have reached the stars without guidance, without the pressure of ancient conflict, without being shaped toward their potential. A pause that felt like the turning of a very large gear. And they have been assimilated, harvested, made into components of a machine that asks nothing of them except their erasure. The Borg aren't a consequence of the absence of Vorlon guidance, Sheridan said. And there was an edge in his voice now. The specific edge of a man who had had this argument before, in different forms, with different ancient beings, and had not changed his position. They're a consequence of a civilization making a catastrophic choice that happens with or without shepherds, sometimes because of shepherds. The Vorlon's light shifted. What Janeway received from that shift was not anger. It was something more complex. The quality of a position being held against pressure that was acknowledged as having some validity. You believe guidance corrupts, that the younger races must find their own way. I believe, Sheridan said carefully, that the cost of guidance, when the guides decide they know better than the guided, is everything that makes the guided worth guiding in the first place. Then explain her. The Vorlon's attention moved to 7 of 9, and the cargo bay's atmosphere changed with it. The quality of focus intensifying, the light shifting toward Seven's alcove with the deliberateness of a searchlight that had been waiting for permission to land. Seven met it. She stood with her hands at her sides, her posture carrying the careful equilibrium of someone who was choosing, consciously and with effort, not to step back. The Vorlon's encoding was doing what it had been designed to do. Every human cell in her body firing its ancient recognition sequence. The million-year-old instruction set working exactly as intended. But 7 of 9 had been rebuilt by the Borg, and the Borg had left their own instruction set. In and underneath both of those was the thing that neither the Vorlons nor the Borg had installed. The self that 7 had constructed in the years since Janeway had separated her from the collective. Built from scratch with the tools of someone who had nothing to start with except the stubborn insistence on existing as an individual. You want to know what I am, 7 said. Her voice was level. You have been asking since you arrived, circling the question, using it as a weapon against the Borg, as an assessment of the captain, as a framework for your argument with President Sheridan. She paused. Ask me directly. The Vorlon regarded her for a long moment. Then it asked, how what arrived in Seven's mind, and what Seven would later describe to Janeway with the careful precision of someone reconstructing an experience that had exceeded her usual vocabulary, was not the simple question it had been asking everyone else. It was the full version, the question beneath the question. Not who are you as an inquiry into identity, but who are you as the central thesis of a million-year argument about the nature of consciousness, freedom, and what beings were supposed to become when given sufficient time and sufficient pressure. The Vorlon had believed in the careful cultivation of potential. They had encoded their philosophy into the genetic architecture of younger races and called it guidance. They had watched those races develop towards something that looked from a sufficient distance is like the Vorlon idea of what younger races should become. And when the younger races had finally told them to leave, when Sheridan had made his stand and the first ones had accepted it, the Vorlons had departed believing or trying to believe that the experiment had succeeded, that the younger races were ready. But one Vorlon had not been able to leave that question unanswered. One had looked at the evidence, at the wars still being fought, at the Borg harvesting the potential of thousands of species, at the terrible ease with which younger races still chose domination over cooperation, erasure over dialogue, and had been unable to accept that the experiment had concluded successfully, had crossed the boundary between universes to find evidence that would resolve the question one way or the other, and had found 7 of 9, who was simultaneously the strongest possible argument for Vorlon guidance, a being who had needed external intervention to reclaim her individuality, and the strongest possible argument against it. Because the intervention that had saved 7 of 9 had not come from an ancient being with a million years of accumulated wisdom. It had come from Catherine Janeway, human, limited, making it up as she went, refusing to give up on a single member of her crew in the middle of 60,000 light-years of hostile territory, because that was the kind of person she had decided to be. 7 stood in the cargo bay's shifting light and felt all of this arrive in her consciousness simultaneously. And the things she did with it, the response she gave the Vorlon, was not what any of them expected. She said, I don't know who I am, and I am still finding out. And that is not a failure of your guidance or a success of it. It is the condition of being a self. She paused. You cross the boundary between universes to find the answer to your question. But the answer to your question is that there is no answer. There is only the process, the finding out. And no being, however ancient, however powerful, can do that process for another. She looked directly at the shifting light that was the closest thing the Vorlon had to a face. You already knew this. Sheridan told you. You left, and you came here because you wanted to be wrong. He paused, quiet and absolute. You are not wrong. The cargo bay was very still. The Vorlon's light shifted through 3 configurations in rapid succession, something Janeway had not seen it do before. The quality of it suggesting not calculation, but response. Raw response. The specific quality of a position held for a million years, encountering an argument it could not immediately dismantle. Then G'Kar spoke from the doorway, his deep voice carrying the particular gravity he used when he was saying something he'd been thinking for a long time. The question, he said, was never whether the younger races were ready. The question was whether the ancient ones were ready to let them be unready. He paused. That is a harder question, and I think you have been avoiding it for longer than any of us have been alive. The Vorlon turned its attention to him. What it delivered in that regard was something G'Kar would not describe afterward, except to say that it felt like being read. Not his surface, not his recent history, but the deep record. The Narn history of occupation and resistance. The long work of rebuilding identity from the wreckage of subjugation. The book he had written and the faith he had constructed, and the man he had become in the space between what had been done to his people and what his people had chosen to do with themselves afterward. When the Vorlon's regard moved away from G'Kar, he stood slightly straighter, as though something had been weighed and found, to his own surprise heavier than expected. It's changing its mind, Delenn said quietly from beside Sheridan. Her voice carried the specific wonder of someone who had believed something impossible was happening and was now watching it happen. In all the years of the Shadow War, and in all our dealings with the Vorlons, I never saw one change its mind. Seven made the argument it couldn't counter, Sheridan said. He was watching the Vorlon with an expression Janeway couldn't fully read. Something between vindication and grief. The emotion of someone who had been right about something at very great cost. The same argument we made on Zhadum, but, he paused, cleaner. She made it without anger, without the weight of the war. The Vorlon's light stabilized, settled. The shifting configurations resolved into a steadier pattern. Not the cold phosphorescence of its arrival, but something warmer, something that felt, if you were inclined to anthropomorphize, like the quality of a decision made. It communicated one final time. And what it delivered was not addressed to any single person, but to all of them. Janeway and Sheridan, Tuvok and G'Kar and Delenn, 7 of 9 standing at her alcove with the Vorlon's ancient question still reverberating in whatever substrate held her. What it said was this: there is a thing coming, in this universe, old, patient. It has been waiting longer than I have. It does not ask questions. It does not guide. It consumes. It is the reason I remained, the reason I crossed. You will need to be ready. Then the light went out, not gradually, instantly. The cargo bay's standard lighting reasserted itself with the faint flicker of systems resuming normal operation. And the Vorlon was simply gone, and the space where it had been was just space. Unordinary and immediate and entirely insufficient to contain what had been standing in it 30 seconds before. Nobody slept. Janeway didn't order anyone to stand down, didn't suggest rest rotations or shift changes, didn't perform the usual captain's theater of maintaining normalcy in the aftermath of the abnormal. The Vorlon's final communication had a specific quality that made the performance of normalcy feel not just inadequate, but actively dishonest. And dishonesty was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Instead, she convened everyone in the mess hall at 0400 hours. Her senior staff, Sheridan's people, the whole improbable constellation of them, and put Neelix to work making coffee and something approximating tea and whatever the Minbari equivalent of comfort food turned out to be. And she let the conversation find its own shape. What the conversation found, after the first 20 minutes of the specific silence that follows encounters with entities that reframe your understanding of your own significance, was the Vorlon's warning. Something old, patient, consuming. It has been waiting longer than I have. Longer than a Vorlon, Chakotay said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. A Vorlon that's been alive for at least 1,000,000 years. Whatever it's describing has been waiting longer than that. The Vorlons are not the oldest things in my universe, G'Kar said. He was sitting with his large hands flat on the table, his amber eyes moving between the people around him with the attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading rooms for threat and finding other things instead. There are beings older still, whereas the walkers of Sigma 957, the one who lives on Sigma 957, being so old that even the Vorlons regarded them with something resembling respect. He paused. But the oldest thing in my universe, the oldest thing we know of, is the universe itself, and the question of what preceded it is one that even the Vorlons declined to answer directly. In this universe, Seven said, the oldest known threat of consuming nature is the Borg. But the Borg are approximately 300 years old as a civilization. That does not match the scale the Vorlon described. She had positioned herself at the end of the table, her coffee untouched, her attention divided between the conversation and something internal that she was processing with the visible effort of someone running a very demanding calculation. There are older threats. Species 8472, peak from fluidic space, predates the Borg but is not patient. Aggression is their primary mode. The Iconians were a civilization of extraordinary advancement that disappeared approximately 200,000 years ago, but there is no evidence they consumed other species. She paused. The Voth claim to be the oldest evolved humanoid species in this universe, but they are not a consuming force. Then we're looking for something that hasn't introduced itself yet, Janeway said. Or something that has been introducing itself very quietly, Tuvok said, for a very long time, in ways we have not recognized as introduction. The mess hall absorbed that, while Neelix moved around the periphery refilling cups with the particular, careful unobtrusiveness of someone who understood that the conversation happening was above his clearance level, but whose instinct for hospitality overrode his instinct for self-preservation. Sheridan was quiet. He had been quiet since the cargo bay, in the specific way he was quiet when he was doing the thing Janeway had identified as his primary cognitive mode. Assembling available information into operational frameworks, testing those frameworks against his experience, discarding what didn't hold. She'd watched him do it in the conference room, in the battle, in the cargo bay. It was, she thought, the most recognizable thing about him, the quality they shared most directly, the part of command that was fundamentally the same regardless of what universe you were commanding in. In my universe, he said finally, when the Vorlons warned about something, they did it because they'd encountered it before. They didn't speculate. They described. He looked at Janeway. The Vorlon didn't say there might be something. It said there is something. Present tense. Already here. Already waiting. He paused. And it said patient. That's the word that concerns me most. Patient implies awareness. It knows you're here. It's choosing its moment. Something that has been in the Delta Quadrant long enough to be patient, Chakotay said slowly. Something we haven't encountered in our time out here or haven't recognized when we encountered it. Torres, who had been making notes on a pad since the conversation started, looked up. I've been running a cross-reference since the cargo bay. Voyager's sensor logs for the entire time we've been in the Delta Quadrant, filtered for anomalies we logged and then deprioritized. Things that didn't fit established categories that we filed as unknown and moved on from because we had more immediate problems. She turned the pad toward Janeway. There are 63 entries. Most of them are explicable in retrospect, spatial phenomena, sensor ghosts, natural anomalies. But 11 of them share a specific characteristic. She paused. They only appear in sensor logs when we weren't looking for them. Every time we ran a dedicated scan of the region where we'd logged one, the anomaly was gone. But in passive background scans, in the data we collect without specifically directing our instruments, they're present, consistent, the same signature in 11 different locations across our journey. Something that knows when you're looking at it, Sheridan said. Something that knows when your instruments are actively directed versus passively collecting, Torres corrected. The distinction matters. It's not avoiding detection, it's avoiding active detection. It's comfortable being seen in the background. It just doesn't want to be examined. Because examination implies awareness of its presence, Seven said, which implies response, which disrupts whatever it is waiting for. She turned to Torres. The 11 locations. Map them. Torres brought up the stellar cartography display on the mess hall's secondary screen, and then the 11 points appeared across the Delta Quadrant's geography with the specific quality of data that meant something, but hadn't yet decided what. Janeway looked at the distribution and felt the back of her mind do something it sometimes did. The pattern recognition that operated faster than conscious analysis. The thing that had made her a good scientist before she'd become a good captain. They're not random, she said. No, Torres agreed. They describe an arc. A very large arc. We've been traveling through the middle of it. She expanded the display to show Voyager's course overlaid on the 11 points, and the shape became clear. A curve of presence, enormous in scale, partially encircling their trajectory through the Delta Quadrant, like the edge of something that dwarfed any structure they had a name for. Now, if you extrapolate the arc to a full circle, don't, Janeway said quietly. Torres looked at her. I can see where it goes. Don't say it yet. She needed a moment with the implication before it became a stated fact, because stated facts had a weight that implications didn't, and she wanted the weight of this one to land correctly. She studied the arc, thought about patience, thought about something that had been waiting. Present tense, the Vorlon had said, in the background of 11 passive sensor logs across years of travel through the Delta Quadrant. Never examined, never engaged, never introducing itself. Waiting. It's been tracking us, Chakotay said. He'd seen the display at the same moment she had. Since we arrived in the Delta Quadrant, these 11 points are observations. It's been watching us travel. Building a picture? Not just us, Seven said. She had risen from her seat and was at the display, her fingers moving across the interface with the rapid efficiency of someone whose processing speed exceeded the room's. These coordinates, 3 of them predate Voyager's arrival in the Delta Quadrant. The passive sensor logs show the signature present before we were in range to generate it as a response to our presence. She turned. It was not tracking us. We traveled into the middle of something it was already doing. Something with a scope that encompasses the entire Delta Quadrant. The mess hall was very quiet. Delenn spoke. And her voice had the quality it carried when she was drawing on the deep reserves of Minbari history and religious tradition that informed her understanding of the universe. The voice she used for things that were old and serious and required the full weight of consideration. The Vorlon said it does not guide. It does not ask questions. It consumes. She paused. In our universe, the shadows believed that strength came from conflict, that they were doing younger races a service by forcing evolution through pressure and chaos. But there was always a question about what they were doing with the results, what conflict produced, where it went, what was harvested from civilizations that destroyed themselves under shadow influence. She looked at Sheridan. We never fully answered that question. Sheridan looked at her. The expression that crossed his face was one Janeway had not seen on him before. Not fear, but the specific quality of a connection being made between things that had been separate and becoming, in the moment of their connection, considerably worse than either had been alone. The shadows weren't just creating pressure, he said slowly. They were, he stopped, worked through it. They were farming. We don't know that, Delenn said carefully. We don't know it isn't. He looked at the display, at the arc, at 11 points of passive presence describing the edge of something patient and enormous and apparently content to watch a Federation starship travel through its territory for years without making itself known. Something that consumes, something patient, was something that's been here long enough that a million-year-old Vorlon crossed universes specifically to warn us about it. He looked at Janeway. What does your Delta Quadrant history tell you about civilizations that simply disappeared? Species that your records show were once present and then weren't? Janeway looked at Seven. Seven was already accessing Voyager's database. Numerous, Seven said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they are simultaneously processing for implications. The Delta Quadrant shows a significantly higher rate of species disappearance than the Alpha or Beta quadrants. We attributed this to the prevalence of hostile powers. The Borg, the Vidians, the Hirogen, interspecies conflict. But if you filter for disappearances that occurred before the Borg's emergence as a civilization, she paused. The pause was long enough to be significant. 47 species, present in geological and stellar record. Gone without the forensic evidence of conventional conflict. No wreckage. No radiation signatures of large-scale weapons. No debris fields. She looked up. They are simply absent, as though they were removed cleanly. The arc on the display seemed to pulse with its own significance in the mess hall's light. It's been here a very long time, Janeway said. Yes, Seven said, and the Borg have been here for 300 years and haven't encountered it. Or, Torres said, with the specific reluctance of someone who had done the math and didn't like the answer, the Borg encountered it and were looking at the result. A civilization 300 years old, with technology far beyond what 300 years of independent development should produce, that assimilates everything it contacts and grows at a rate that doesn't match its origin timeline. She set down her pad. What if the Borg didn't develop their technology? What if they were given it? The mess hall held that question in the silence it deserved. By something that found a collective consciousness more useful than individual civilizations, Chakotay said quietly. By something that needed a harvesting mechanism. Sheridan stood up slowly. He moved to the viewport and looked out at the Delta Quadrant dark, at the Vorlon vessel still alongside them, its bioluminescent hull pulsing with its slow ancient rhythm. Were its presence suddenly carrying a different quality? Not the cryptic authority of a being that knew more than it was telling, but the specific gravity of a being that had come, at very great cost to its own certainties, to ask for help. It came to warn us, Sheridan said, but it also came because it can't fight this alone. He turned from the viewport. In my universe, it took every younger race working together, and the Vorlons and the Shadows, and every first one who could be moved to act, to end the argument and send the Ancient Ones beyond the rim. And that wasn't a war. That was a confrontation, a moral stand. He looked at Janeway. Whatever this is, whatever has been patient in your Delta Quadrant for longer than the Vorlons have been alive, it didn't leave when asked. It's still here. Which means it doesn't respond to moral stands. Then what does it respond to? Janeway asked. Sheridan looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his life finding answers to exactly that kind of question and had learned to be very careful about the cost of finding them. That, he said, is what we need to figure out before it decides we've been observed long enough. On the display, the arc described its patient curve through the Delta Quadrant, and somewhere within its enormous geometry, 47 absent civilizations kept their silence. The answer came from G'Kar. Not because G'Kar was the most technically sophisticated person in the room. That distinction belonged to Seven, with Tora as a close second. And not because he had specific knowledge of the entity they were facing, because none of them did. It came from G'Kar because G'Kar had spent the better part of his life thinking about the nature of subjugation, and what he understood about subjugation was this. Every system of consumption, regardless of its scale or sophistication, had a fundamental requirement. It needed its subjects to remain subjects. It needed them to be, in some essential way, unable to conceive of themselves as anything else. He laid it out in the mess hall in the gray hour before Voyager's artificial dawn cycle, his deep voice carrying the particular quality it carried when he was at the intersection of the personal and the philosophical, the place where G'Kar was most himself. The Narn were occupied by the Centauri for 100 years, he said. In that time, the Centauri did not simply take our resources or our labor. They took our history, our names, our capacity to imagine ourselves as a people with a future, because a people who cannot imagine their own future cannot organize toward it. He paused. Whatever has been patient in your Delta Quadrant for longer than the Vorlons have existed, it has been doing the same thing on a cosmic scale, not taking planets, taking the capacity of civilizations to conceive of themselves as lasting things. The disappearances, Janeway said, not destruction, erasure. G'Kar looked at Seven. The Borg do not destroy civilizations either. They absorb them, remove their distinctiveness, reduce the question of identity to irrelevance. He paused. And the Vorlon told us the entity does not guide, does not ask questions, it consumes. But consumption, at this scale, requires that what is consumed first lose the capacity to resist. Now, not through force, through the dissolution of the self-concept that makes resistance possible. It answers the Borg question, Torres said, picking up the thread with the speed of someone whose mind had been running parallel calculations. If this entity has been operating in the Delta Quadrant for millions of years, using civilizations as resource, the Borg would be the most efficient harvesting mechanism it could have encountered. A collective that voluntarily erases individual identity, that actively seeks out and absorbs the distinctiveness of every species it contacts. From the entity's perspective, the Borg aren't a threat. They're infrastructure. The Borg do the work, Chakotay said slowly, and the entity collects the result. We need to know what the result is, Janeway said, what it's actually consuming. Because if we understand that, we understand what it needs. And if we understand what it needs, we understand what it cannot afford to lose, Sheridan finished. He had been standing at the viewport for the last hour, thinking in the specific stillness he used for his hardest problems. And now he turned back to the room with the expression of someone who had arrived at a position they weren't entirely comfortable with, but had decided was correct. In the Shadow War, the decisive moment wasn't a battle, it wasn't a weapon, it was a question. Specifically, two questions. Sheridan asked the Shadows what they wanted. Delenn asked the Vorlons who they were. And those questions broke the argument open because neither side could answer without acknowledging the thing they'd been refusing to acknowledge. that they were as limited as the younger races they presumed to guide. "You want to ask this entity a question?" Tuvok said. "I want to do what the Vorlon came here to do," Sheridan said. "It didn't cross between universes to fight this thing. It crossed because it knew that whatever this entity is, it predates warfare as a concept. Fighting it is what it expects, what it's prepared for. 47 civilizations probably tried fighting it." He paused. "The Vorlon came because it had learned, at very great cost, and through the Shadow War and through what Seven said to it in the cargo bay, that the thing ancient consuming forces cannot process is genuine individual identity asserting itself without apology and without the framework the consuming force has constructed. Seven's argument," Delenn said quietly, "that the process of finding out who you are cannot be done by another, cannot be consumed, because the moment it is observed from outside, it changes. It becomes something else. Consciousness observed is not the same as consciousness experiencing," Seven said. She said it with the specific quality of someone who had arrived at the same place through a different route. The Borg discovered this. Assimilated consciousness is not individual consciousness. It is the pattern of it, copied and stored, but the living quality, was the ongoing process of being a self, cannot survive assimilation. It requires the original substrate. It requires, she paused, it requires privacy, the internal space that cannot be accessed from outside without being destroyed in the accessing. "Then that is what it cannot consume," Gakar said. "The process, not the result of the process, not identity as a fixed thing, a label, a pattern to be copied. The living act of becoming, of not yet knowing and continuing anyway." Janeway looked around the room at the faces of people from two universes who had arrived at the same place from completely different directions, and felt the particular quality of convergence that she had learned over years of commanding Voyager to trust. Not because convergence meant certainty, it never meant certainty, but because it meant the thinking had been done as well as the available minds could do it. The rest was action. "I need to talk to the Vorlon," she said, "directly, and I need it to tell me where this entity currently is." Getting the Vorlon to communicate on demand proved, as Sheridan had predicted, non-trivial. The ancient vessel had remained alongside Voyager through the night, its presence a constant luminous fact in the port viewport, but it had not initiated contact since its cargo bay appearance, and it did not respond to hailing frequencies in any configuration Kim attempted. What eventually worked, and Janeway suspected this was not accidental, was 7 of 9 standing at the cargo bay viewport and saying in a normal speaking voice, "Tish, we are ready to know where it is." The response was immediate and arrived, as always, in the direct-to-consciousness mode that bypassed language. But this time it arrived with a specificity that previous communications had lacked. Precise, almost technical, as though the Vorlon had decided that the time for cryptic circumlocution had passed, and plain information was what the situation required. What it communicated was a location, not coordinates in any system Voyager used, but a physical description. Stellar geography delivered as impression and sensation, the deep space equivalent of someone placing your hand on a map. The subconscious processes that received it translated it into spatial understanding, and Torres immediately began converting that understanding into navigational data. What it also communicated was urgency. When the entity had noted the battle with the Borg, had noted the Vorlon's defensive field over Voyager, had been not alarmed, because patients of that age didn't alarm easily, but attentive in a new way. The passive observation that had characterized its relationship with Voyager's journey through the Delta Quadrant had shifted. The variable of the Vorlon's presence had changed its calculus. It was, the Vorlon communicated with the specific quality of a being that had watched this pattern before and knew what came next, beginning to move toward active engagement. "How long?" Janeway asked. The Vorlon's response was the temporal equivalent of soon, a quantity of time that felt, in the communication's emotional register, like the last interval before a threshold was crossed. Measured in hours, not many. "Then we go to it," Janeway said. "Why, we don't wait for it to come to us on its terms." "Going to it is also its term," Tuvok said. "We should consider that this may be precisely what it expects. It expects us to either fight it or flee it, Sheridan said. We're going to do neither. He looked at Janeway. We need one more thing from the Vorlon, something it's going to resist giving. What? Its voice, Sheridan said. Not its presence. Its voice. The direct-to-consciousness communication. I need it to be willing to speak to this entity directly, on our behalf when we get there. He paused. Because whatever we're going to say to this thing, the Vorlon is the only one of us old enough for the entity to consider worth addressing. Janeway looked at Seven. Seven gave a small nod. The specific nod that meant she understood the ask and believed it was achievable. It's not because the Vorlon would find it easy, but because the argument for it was sound. Seven returned to the cargo bay viewport. You said something is coming, she said to the luminous vessel beyond the hull. You crossed between universes because you could not stop it alone. We are offering to stand with you, but you have to trust us enough to speak when we ask. She paused. You have been asking who we are since you arrived. You have your answer. Now the question is who you are. Whether you are still a shepherd unwilling to act without control, or whether you have learned, as you suggested we have not, that the most important things cannot be done alone. The Vorlon vessel's bioluminescence shifted, settled, pulsed once with a warmth that hadn't been present before. It communicated its agreement in the cleanest, least cryptic message it had delivered since its arrival. I will speak when you ask. Voyager and the White Starfleet moved together toward the location the Vorlon had indicated, a region of space approximately 14 hours at maximum warp, a dark area of the Delta Quadrant that Voyager's charts showed as empty, featureless, unremarkable. The kind of place that patient things chose specifically because unremarkable regions went unexamined. And unexamined regions were where you could wait for geological ages without interruption. During those 14 hours, Janeway slept for 3 of them and spent the remaining 11 doing what she always did in the hours before something that might kill her: working. She talked to every member of her crew, not about the mission, not about tactics or contingencies or probability assessments. She talked to them the way she learned to talk to people who had been a long way from home for a long time and had built a home out of each other instead. About small things, real things, the texture of being the people they were. She understood in a way she hadn't fully articulated before why the Vorlon's question had resonated so deeply with Seven. Not because Seven didn't know who she was, but because Seven was in the most alive part of the answer, the part where you were still finding out, the part that couldn't be consumed because it wasn't finished yet. She stopped outside the cargo bay at hour 11 and looked in at Seven, who was regenerating now, or attempting to, standing in her alcove with her eyes closed, in the particular stillness that was as close as Seven got to rest. Janeway watched her for a moment and thought about 47 civilizations that hadn't had someone to stand with them, and about the difference between an entity that consumed and a crew that stayed. Then she went back to the bridge. At hour 14, Voyager and the White Star Fleet dropped out of warp in the unremarkable region of the Delta Quadrant that the Vorlon had indicated. Space here was dark in a way that differed from ordinary deep space dark. Ordinary dark was the absence of light, the neutral condition of space between sources of illumination. This dark felt like presence, like something was absorbing the light that should have been there, consuming it as it arrived, maintaining the darkness as a condition rather than allowing it as a default. The entity was not immediately visible. Then it was, because it had decided to be, and the decision was itself a demonstration of scale, because what became visible was not a vessel, not a structure, not anything that suggested the limitations of a body moving through space. It was an area, a region of altered space approximately the size of a gas giant, its boundaries defined not by any physical surface, but by the specific quality of the dark around it. Dense, directed, intentional. Sensors, Janeway said, reading an energy density inconsistent with any known spatial phenomenon, Tuvok reported, with the measured precision of a Vulcan confronting something his training had not equipped him to name. The entity appears to exist partially within normal space and partially within a subspace domain we do not have instruments capable of fully measuring. Its age, he paused, My instruments decline to place an upper bound. Can it hear us? Seven stood at her station. It is already aware of us. It has been aware of us for the last 6 hours of our approach. She paused. It is waiting to see what we do. Janeway opened a channel. Not a targeting solution, not a shield configuration, a hailing frequency. The universal first gesture of a civilization that believed communication was always worth attempting. My name is Catherine Janeway, she said. I am the captain of the Federation starship Voyager. I am speaking to you on behalf of the people of this ship, the Interstellar Alliance, and a being who has waited a very long time to have this conversation. She paused. We know what you are. We know what you have been doing in this quadrant. And we are here to tell you that it is finished. Not because we can force you to stop, but because the thing you consume cannot be taken by force. It can only be offered, and we are not offering it. The dark entity was still. Then Seven of Nine said, now, and Janeway nodded, and the Vorlon spoke. What the Vorlon said to the entity, what it delivered in the direct-to-consciousness mode that operated beyond language, beyond the limitations of any communication technology either universe had developed, was not a threat and not a plea. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a witness. The Vorlon had been alive for 1,000,000 years. It had watched civilizations grow and fall and be consumed by this thing over a span of geological time. And now it named them. Each one, the 47 that had disappeared without wreckage, one without radiation, without the honest forensic evidence of conflict. It named them the way Gakar had learned to name things. Not as inventory, not as data, but as individuals who had existed and mattered and whose absence was a specific loss rather than a general statistic. The naming took 11 minutes. When it was finished, the dark entity was very still. Sheridan's voice came over the comm from his white star. Quiet, certain. The question, he said to Janeway. Ask it the question. Janeway looked at the dark region of altered space, where something older than the Vorlons existed in the patient silence of geological time. And she thought about Seven of Nine finding out who she was, and Gakar rebuilding his people from the wreckage of occupation, and Sheridan standing before the first ones with the audacity of a man who had decided that even gods had to earn their authority, and she opened her channel again. Who are you? She asked. The dark entity moved. Not toward them, inward. A contraction, a gathering, the specific quality of something very large confronting a question it had not been asked in longer than any of them had been alive. Perhaps longer than the question had existed in any form capable of being asked. The darkness around it deepened and then shifted. And what happened in that shift was not answerable in any scientific vocabulary Voyager's instruments possessed. But Seven of Nine, at her station, made a sound. The small, involuntary sound she'd made when the Vorlon signal first reached the Borg cube. And then she said, with the precision of someone reporting sensor data, it is experiencing something. The question created a recursion. It attempted to process the question through its consumption framework, and the consumption framework does not have an answer. And the absence of an answer within a system designed exclusively for acquisition and consumption is... She stopped. Seven, Janeway said. It is the same problem the Borg face, Seven said quietly. When you ask the collective who it is, the collective can tell you what it has assimilated, what it has taken, what it contains. But the question of who it is, the original, the self that existed before the taking began, is a question the collective cannot answer because the answer was the first thing consumed. She looked at the view screen. This entity has been consuming for so long that the question of its original identity is not suppressed. It is simply gone. It does not know who it is. It has not known for longer than the Vorlons have existed. The dark region of altered space was very still. Then it began, slowly and with the specific quality of something happening that was irreversible, to contract further, pulling inward, drawing its boundaries tight. The consumption field that had characterized its presence in the Delta Quadrant, folding back toward its center like a tide retreating. It's withdrawing, Torres said from engineering, her voice carrying honest disbelief. The energy field. It's collapsing inward. The dark area is shrinking. Where is it going? Chakotay asked. Tuvok ran his scan. Inward, he said, into its own subspace domain. It is retreating from normal space. He paused. Entirely. The process took 40 minutes. Voyager and the White Star Fleet held position and watched the dark region of altered space that had been patiently present in the Delta Quadrant for longer than any of them had words for slowly, steadily, completely withdraw from the universe of normal space into whatever substrate had been its original home. Before the consuming had begun, before the 47 civilizations, before the Borg, before the patience that had outlasted everything except the one question it could not answer. When it was gone, the space it had occupied was just space, ordinary and immediate and filled with the usual Delta Quadrant dark and starlight that was now reaching places it hadn't reached in geological ages, and the slowly returning sensor signatures of a region beginning, incrementally, to breathe again. The Vorlon vessel pulsed once, warm, steady. Then it was gone too, not inward, but outward, accelerating on a heading that Tuvok identified as the galactic rim with a speed that Voyager's sensors lost within seconds. Beyond the rim, where the others had gone, where it had perhaps always needed to go, and had stayed too long because of a question it couldn't let go of, until the answer had been demonstrated by a crew 60,000 light-years from home, and a president from another universe, and a Narn who had spent his life learning to name things properly. The silence that followed was the good kind, not the weighted anticipatory silence of the Delta Quadrant's usual dark, not the held-breath silence of a crew waiting for something to go wrong in a new and creative way. This was the silence of aftermath, the specific quality of quiet that arrived when something enormous had resolved, and the people who had survived it were still catching up to the fact of their own survival. Janeway sat in her command chair and let it exist for a full minute without filling it, which was for her an act of genuine discipline. Then she said, "Report." The reports came in with the efficient cadence of a crew that had been through enough crises to know that the first order of business after surviving something was determining precisely what you'd survived. Torres confirmed that the entity's energy field had fully withdrawn from normal space on all sensor frequencies, including the passive background scans that had been tracking its signature across 11 locations and years of unwitting travel. The signature was gone, not diminished, not retreating at distance. Gone as completely as the Vorlon vessel that had accompanied them to this moment and then departed with the quiet finality of something that had finished its business and knew it. Kim confirmed no Borg vessels within long-range sensor range. The cube they'd driven off during the battle had not returned, which Seven assessed as consistent with a collective that was still processing approximately 4 minutes of unprecedented individual recursion among its drones and the structural implications of molecular disruption weapons it had never encountered before. It would return eventually. The Borg always returned, but eventually was not today. And today was what they had. Tuvok confirmed all ship systems nominal, shields at full, weapons at standby. The Vorlon's protective field had withdrawn with the vessel itself, which meant Voyager was back to being a ship that sensors could resolve clearly, which was the correct condition for a ship that had nothing left to hide from. Chakotay confirmed the White Star Fleet was undamaged and in formation alongside them. Sheridan confirmed he was coming to the bridge. He arrived looking the way Janeway suspected she looked. The particular combination of exhaustion and alertness that belonged to people who had slept 3 hours and 40 and spent the balance doing things that required their full attention. He stood beside her command chair and looked at the view screen, where the space that had been the entity's territory now showed nothing exceptional. Just stars and the ordinary distances between them and the slow return of sensor data from regions that had been obscured for longer than recorded history. "It'll come back," he said, not as a warning, as an honest assessment. "Maybe," Janeway said. "Or maybe the question does what questions sometimes do, keeps working on the thing it was asked of, even after the conversation ends." She paused. Seven thinks the recursion is ongoing, that asking something what it is, when it has no answer, creates a process it can't stop running, like asking someone to not think about something. Sheridan considered this. "The shadows never came back," he said. "After Zahatam, After the confrontation, they left and they didn't return. But I spent a long time wondering if that was because they'd accepted the argument or because they were reconstituting somewhere beyond the rim, waiting for the right moment. He paused. I still don't know. How do you live with that? He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she recognized from the inside. The expression of someone who had made peace with uncertainty, not because uncertainty had become comfortable, but because it was the honest condition of a universe that didn't resolve into clean answers, regardless of how much you'd sacrificed to ask the right questions. Carefully, he said, furning and with good people nearby. The debrief took 3 hours and occurred in the conference room with the particular thoroughness of two command structures that had operated in close coordination through a crisis and needed to establish shared understanding of what had actually happened before their accounts diverged into the separate narratives each universe would eventually construct. Janeway ran it the way she ran all debriefs, systematically without hierarchy of contribution, with the explicit goal of arriving at the most accurate possible picture rather than the most comfortable one. What emerged from 3 hours of careful reconstruction was this. They had done something unprecedented in either universe, and they had done it through the specific combination of capabilities that neither side would have possessed alone. It Voyager's technical and tactical resources, the White Star Fleet's Vorlon hybrid weapons and military experience, Gakar's understanding of subjugation's mechanics and the philosophy of resistance, Delen's Minbari perspective on the ancient races, Sheridan's experience of the Shadow War's decisive moment and the moral architecture it had established. 7 of 9's particular existence as the argument that neither the Vorlon's guiding philosophy nor the Borg's consuming one had been able to produce, the self that had assembled itself in the space between two kinds of erasure and refused to be resolved into either, and the Vorlon, who had stayed when the others left, had crossed between universes carrying a warning and a question, and the slowly developing understanding that it could not do what needed to be done alone. Aaron had finally, in the cargo bay, listening to Seven, listening to Gakar, learned the thing it had been trying to teach younger races for 1,000,000 years without ever learning itself. That the most important things required trust, required the willingness to act in concert with beings whose methods you didn't fully control and whose outcomes you couldn't fully predict. Required, in the end, the surrender of the shepherd's position and the acceptance of something more like partnership. It thanked us, Delen said, at one point in the debrief. Before it left, the communication was very brief, but that was what it conveyed. I felt it, Seven said. A Vorlon expressing gratitude is... She paused, searching for the appropriate descriptor. Structurally unusual. First time for everything, Sheridan said. In the afternoon of Voyager's artificial day cycle, Janeway found herself on the holodeck running a program she hadn't accessed in months. A coffee shop, early morning, rain against the windows, the specific sensory experience of being in a place that felt like before. She sat with a real cup of coffee, or as real as the holodeck's molecular replication allowed, and thought about home, which was what she always thought about. And then she thought about what the Vorlon had said to her in the cargo bay. You lead toward home, always toward home. Every decision filtered through the question of return. She had bristled at it then, the way she bristled at accurate assessments. But sitting here in the holodeck with the Delta Quadrant on the other side of Voyager's hull and 60,000 light years still between her and the Alpha Quadrant, though she turned the observation over and looked at its other side, the side the Vorlon hadn't stated but had perhaps intended. Leading toward home meant knowing what home was, meant carrying it as a fixed point, a navigational constant, the thing that gave direction to every decision. It was not a small thing to know what you were steering toward. Plenty of people didn't. Plenty of civilizations didn't. 47 of them had lost the capacity to know before they'd had the chance to find out. She finished her coffee, went back to the bridge. Sheridan was in the corridor outside the holodeck, apparently having the same impulse towards somewhere quiet and finding the same insufficiency in the available options. He looked slightly surprised to see her, then not surprised, the expression of someone recognizing a quality he shared. We need to talk about getting you home, she said. I know. The jump point your white stars opened, Can you reopen it from this side? Our navigators think so. The Vorlon's field may have stabilized the dimensional boundary enough to make the return passage cleaner than the entry. He paused. We'll know when we try. And if it doesn't work? He looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his entire adult life in situations where the fallback plan was improvisation. Then we figure something else out. We're good at that. We are, she agreed. They stood in the corridor for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who had been through something together and hadn't yet decided what to call it. Then Janeway said, "For what it's worth, your people are extraordinary." Gakar's argument about subjugation mechanics, Delen's reading of the Vorlon's emotional state, the White Star Fleet's tactical coordination. She paused. And you, the instinct about the Shadow War, the question asked of the entity, that was the turn. Sheridan shook his head slightly. Seven made the argument in the cargo bay. Seven's argument is what changed the Vorlon. The Vorlon's testimony is what reached the entity. He stopped. We just understood what to do with what she gave us. That's leadership, Janeway said. Yes, Sheridan agreed. It usually is. The jump point opened the following morning with the clean amber light of dimensional passage and the specific quality of a boundary being crossed with permission, different from the wound in space that had deposited the White Star Fleet in the Delta Quadrant. Smoother, more intentional, when as though the universe were acknowledging a return rather than resisting an intrusion. The white stars assembled in their formation, white hulls catching the Delta Quadrant's starlight one last time. Sheridan stood on Voyager's transporter pad with Delen beside him and Gakar a half-step behind. And the quality of the moment was one that Janeway had experienced before. The specific gravity of a parting between people who had been through something together that neither side would be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't been present. If you ever find your way back, she said, to your universe or to ours, my door's open. Likewise, Sheridan said. And Captain, he paused. The entity asked what it was and couldn't answer. But you know what you are. That's not nothing. In a universe full of things that consume and things that shepherd and things that impose their understanding of what everyone else should become, he looked at her steadily. Knowing what you are is the rarest thing. He energized. The white stars went through the jump point in formation, and the amber light contracted and closed, and the space where they had been was just space again, ordinary and immediate, and full of the Delta Quadrant's usual dark. Janeway stood on her bridge and looked at where the jump point had been, and then at the stars ahead of them, and thought about home, and about the journey toward it, and about whether those were the same thing or whether the Vorlon had been right that she hadn't yet decided. Seven appeared at her shoulder. Captain, long-range sensors are detecting a spatial phenomenon approximately 30 light-years on our current heading. Configuration unknown. I have no matching entry in our database. Janeway looked at the readout, then at the stars, then at her crew. The people who had been through something extraordinary and were already with the particular resilience of people who had built their home out of each other, turning toward the next thing. Log it, she said, and set a course. Voyager moved forward into the Delta Quadrant's dark, carrying its questions with it, which was the only honest way to carry them. The Vorlon had gone beyond the rim at last, carrying with it the answer it had crossed universes to find. Not the answer it had expected, but the one that mattered. 7 of 9 stood in Cargo Bay 2 that evening, not regenerating, looking at the stars through the viewport with the expression of someone who had been asked the deepest question available and had given the only honest answer possible. I am still finding out. The entity that had consumed 47 civilizations in patient silence had withdrawn into its own recursion, confronted at last by the question it had no machinery to process. The Borg would return, as the Borg always returned, but they would return to a Delta Quadrant where the infrastructure of their largest, oldest patron had folded back into subspace, and what that meant for the collective's architecture was a question that would take considerably longer than days to answer. While Sheridan had gone home to his alliance carrying the knowledge that the ancient forces his universe had resolved were still resolving their counterparts in others, that the work of becoming, the endless, unfinished work of civilizations learning who they were, was not a local problem, but a cosmic one. And Voyager moved on, as Voyager always moved on, 60,000 light years from home, with a crew that knew what they were and a captain who was still, carefully and honestly, finding out.